Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Researching Your Historic Property with me, Christiana Limniatis, Preservation Maryland's Program and Outreach Manager. Thank you for being patient. I just wanted to give a couple of minutes so that more people can join the room. So tonight we're going to talk about researching your historic property here in Maryland. Before we get to the program, let's take care of a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded this evening and will be made available later. Everyone registered for tonight's event will get a follow-up email with information about accessing that recording and the various links and materials that we discussed tonight as well. As tonight is in a webinar format, no one will be able to unmute themselves to ask a question, but I certainly want you to ask questions. I want to answer all of your questions tonight. So we're going to be submitting those through the Zoom platform. All questions will be saved for the end of the program during a Q&A session. Even though the questions will be saved for the end, you don't have to wait till the end to submit your questions. As soon as they pop into your head, by all means, click those into the system so they're ready for the Q&A portion. When submitting your questions, please be mindful of how you're doing so. For questions that you want me to answer live tonight, please make sure to use that Q&A button and submit them through there. There is also the chat function that's really more for kind of commentary and other kind of notes like that. Tonight, I'm also joined by my coworker, Maggie Pelta-Pauls, and she'll be using the chat to share some links to some of the various resources that we're going to talk about. So if you want to access those in the moment, you'll be able to click on those links. But again, if you have any questions that you want answered tonight live by me, please make sure to put them into the Q&A. All right, let's get started. So tonight's program is part of a researching series that we've been working on here at Preservation Maryland. Back in December, Maggie, who is our secret moderator here, wrote a blog detailing her work to research the history of the Berlin House, a property in Brunswick that we are working with the city to rehabilitate. And along with releasing that blog post, we also released our property research guide, which provides information on all the types of key documents you should consult when researching a property here in Maryland. There's a mix of online and in-person search options for a variety of different governmental agencies, nonprofit organizations, and private collections. As I mentioned during the program, Maggie has already shared some of the links in that chat, so you can access that right away. While tonight's program is going to focus about researching here in Maryland, the general principles that we're going to discuss are fairly universal. So whether your project is here in Maryland, or maybe you have other houses or other friends that need help in other communities, other states, the principles and policies and processes that we're going to review are fairly universal. All righties. So before you begin your research adventure, it's important to identify your goals and purpose. While the process of researching your document is basically the same no matter what that goal is, how you maintain your records and keep track of your sources and the information you gain is going to be slightly different based on what that end goal is, and whether or not your goal is a regulatory or formal research document, or if it's just kind of a fun side pursuit. A regulatory or research document is something like a formal history of your property, maybe a landmark nomination, a National Register nomination. Historic tax credit applications often require including history of your property as well. A side pursuit, again, is just kind of a side project, a fun thing to see who lived in your house, just like you would kind of dabble into your family's genealogy. Both are perfectly valid reasons to research your property. But if you do plan on one day using your research to produce a landmark nomination or one of those more formal documents, then you'll want to be mindful to keep a more detailed record of your sources and the information that you gathered from each of them. Preservation planning documents almost always require citations, footnotes or endnotes, and full bibliographies. So again, you'll want to be mindful of, you figured out this fact, but how and where did you get that fact from? You'll also usually spend more time researching the details around the building original construction and the changes to that building over time thereafter, because in preservation regulatory documents, you often need to discuss the integrity of the resource and document how and why it was changed. And that might not be something that you care to know about if you're just having a nice little fun research adventure. You may also need to research certain aspects of the property's history or something associated with the property so that you can successfully meet whatever criteria you're working to meet into to successfully landmark that nomination. So again, if you're doing that kind of regulatory document, you might have to go on a little bit more side tangents that you would for just seeing who lived in your property. No matter which way or what you're doing, why you're going on this research adventure, it is good to be organized, right? You're going to spend all this time to go down these rabbit holes and get into the weeds of things. It would be worthwhile to keep track of where you went and how you got there. Even if it is just for your personal enjoyment, who's to say that a relative might not want to pick up that research in the future and turn it into something more official? Or it might not be something, or it might be something that you pass on to the next owner of the property, and they might want to continue that research on. So again, just always beneficial to be organized. On the screen here, you can see some screenshots showing how I like to organize my documents and my information. For me, a key part is having an Excel spreadsheet where I put in every single bit of information that I find for a property. So you can see here just a little snippet of a property here in Baltimore City that I was researching on, using all the fancy formatting options of Excel to be able to organize things chronologically, to color code by the source, the type of source. That's incredibly helpful so that you can visually see if you're relying too much on one type of resource, and maybe you should try and check other types of resources and see if there's other information that you can fill in for those time periods. And then for the documents that you keep copies of, again, you just don't want to have a folder on your computer or a physical folder that's all just a mashup of all these random documents with weird titles. Have some sort of system to it. Again, I like chronological order, so you can see a typical way that I like to organize it, having that year in the beginning, having an explanation of what type of source it is, and then more details about what that document is. Obviously, whatever way that makes most sense for your brain is the best way to go. This is just how my brain thinks it makes sense. All righty, so that is kind of just that brief understanding of that general process and the background of how you would start these projects. Now we're going to quickly as possible as we can this evening, go through these 6 types of documents. These are kind of the usual suspect documents that you want to try and consult when researching a property. We'll learn why you should consult them, the type of information they include as well as strategies of how to access and navigate these resources. Again, for sake of time tonight, we're going to move as quickly as we can through them. There's a lot of documents, a lot of information to share, but our property guide has all of this information in it. Not just the documents that I'm going to talk about tonight and the sources that I'm going to talk about tonight, but additional types of documents that we're not going to cover and other institutions and repositories that you can access. So again, please make sure to go check out our property research guide. The most important thing to keep in mind, no matter which type of resource that you're working with, is to start with the present and work backwards. There might be, just starting from today and working backwards. There might be times where you, in doing that, find new information, new names, new events or organizations, and you'll have to kind of go back into the future to research those titles, and you might have to jump around a little bit, but you really do want to try and start from present day, working all the way backwards. I've been working in historic preservation for longer than I would care to admit on a recorded broadcast. And I feel like in my career, the times where I have messed up a property researching have been those times where I got a little too big in my britches and I started in the middle of a story, started in the middle of the timeline, and I've always messed up with that. So again, starting from today and moving backwards. So the documents that we're going to review tonight is first the previous survey work and current data. Then we'll talk about deeds, maps, tax assessments and permits, census documents, and then newspapers, publications, images, and ephemera type stuff. So for previous survey work and current data, by previous survey work, I'm referring to those historic resource surveys, the Maryland Historic Property Inventory Forms, National Register nomination, local level nominations, any other previously completed preservation planning document that might be accessible. Now, the first step to see if there are any such documents for your property is to visit the Maryland Historic Trust site's Medusa site. Maryland Historical Trust, or MHT for short, is our state historic preservation office. They're our regulatory agency for preservation at the state level, and they maintain a large collection of documentation related to our historic built environment. On this Medusa site, you can put in your address and be able to see what documents are available to you for that. Here on the screen, you can see that I've used it as an example, the building that Preservation Maryland's offices are located in, here on Clipper Road in the Baltimore City. And you can see that that address is associated. I can access a National Register nomination for the building, and I can access a state inventory form about the building. I can also navigate on the map to see any neighboring documents that might exist. So again, depending on your property, depending on its designation status, you might have 1 or 2 things, you might have 5 things, you might have 0 things, but it's always great to check this resource first. MHT is not the only regulatory agency that maintains these types of records about our historic built environment. You'll also want to check with your local municipality or county to see if they have any landmark or designation or inventory forms about your property. Here on the screen, you can see screenshots of Frederick County Register and the Maryland County Register. Montgomery County Register, they on their websites for their preservation departments have access. You can access these inventories and see what information is available. Not all communities have these kind of fancy interactive systems, so you might just have to pick up the phone or shoot an email to the planning or preservation office to see if they have any information. And I did just see that someone raised their hand again. There is not an option to unmute yourselves today. So if you have questions, put it right into that Q&A box as soon as they pop into your brain. So in addition to that previous survey work and checking to see if there's been previous research done on your property, you want to also get the current data for your property, right? So that means your current tax assessment information. This information can be accessed by visiting the Maryland Department of Assessment and Taxation using their SDAT system, and Maggie's sharing that link right now. And here is a screenshot of what the main page looks like when you go to that website. So you'll be able to select the county that you want to search in, and then the method of which you want to undertake that search, either by the address or other property identifier items. I think that Baltimore City does allow you to search by name, but for the most part, it's not going to be by name. It's going to be about things having to do with the property. Once you enter, you successfully navigate that search and find your building, you're going to see a screen that looks like this. Again, using our office building here in Baltimore, the former London Fog factory, let's talk about the key information that you're going to pull from this page. So the first bit of information you want to find is your account identifier, and that's what's highlighted in this orange box up here. This is the number that's assigned to a parcel of real property by the tax assessor for identification and record keeping. It might slightly vary from community to community. Here in the city of Baltimore, we have wards that divide up the city, so that's why there's a ward number as part of it. But not all municipalities have a ward. Some have districts, some don't use those terminologies. So there'll be a little slight difference, but almost all of them will include a section, block, and lot number. For those of you doing research in other states, many other states simply refer to this identifier as the SLB number. So that's kind of a universal tax assessment tool. I just said everything that was written on my paper. Thank you. The next bit of information on this document that you want to access and record is the owner name. So this is going to confirm who the current property owner. Obviously, if you are the property owner that you're researching your own house, you should see your name there. But if you're doing research on a property that you don't own, this will give you that confirmation of who the property owner is. Next is going to be references to the current and previous deeds, and that's going to be found in two different spots on this page, and that's highlighted in the green box, the olive green box. Here at the top, you'll see a quick deed reference listing the book and page number that deed is been registered or recorded under. It's in effect kind of like the call number for your deed. That's how you're going to go and pull that, whether you're doing it in person or online. And then lower down on the page, down where it says transfer information, you'll see a more detailed entry for that deed reference. So here you can see that the seller of that, the grantor as part of that relationship was the Utah property, and then it has the dates, and then it has the full entry identifier for that deed, which includes these three initials at the start, and then the book number, and then the page number. The three initials at the start, sometimes it's only 2 letters, but those initials relate to the initials of the clerk, the county clerk or the city clerk, who is operating that book, who is working under that book number. It's an interesting little quirky thing about Maryland that they include the initials as part of that book. But that whole thing, the initials, the book number, the page number is your deed reference that you'll need to then go find that deed. Depending on when other previous sales occurred, if there were a lot of recent sales, then it might also include those additional sales. Sometimes if the property hasn't been sold for quite a long time, it might just list the most recent one. And so again, that's incredibly helpful because you can come to this website and see, get immediately right away those most recent deeds instead of having to go through all of the inventory and searching those. You have a nice baseline of what that chain of title looks like. And then the last thing that you want to pull from this website is the legal description here in this gray box. Because this building is a large factory building, it has an irregular dimensions to it. It's listed in acreage here, but for most properties, you're going to see a dimension, right? You're going to see, a 50 feet by 150 feet, something like that. And that's incredibly important to know and to have at the start of your information. Throughout your work to research your property, you're going to be seeing your account identifier, your section block lot number on a bunch of different types of documents. You're also going to see your lot description, the legal description of the lot. And so to make sure that you're following the correct property backwards in time, you need to know that you're connecting the dots with that same property, that you're maintaining the line on that same property. So having that legal description is really, really helpful at the start. All right. So that is previous survey work and current data. Now we are going to jump to deeds. So deeds, I think most people understand the concept that it traces the ownership of a property over time. It's also referred to as the chain of title. Each deed will provide the names of the grantor, that's the person selling the property, the name of the grantee, that's the person buying the property. You can see I put a little chart there to explain that process. I know that it kind of makes sense, but when you're doing the research, you can very easily kind of get twisted and turned around, because the second you find a new name who is the grantor, you then need to immediately turn around and look them up as the grantee so you can see who they bought it from. And I've definitely gotten mixed up in my life researching properties of, wait, whose name am I looking under which inventory? So again, it's nice to just kind of keep that set in your record keeping of who's who at what time. It's also important to note that deeds rarely include specific information about a building, such as its construction date or major characteristics. There are certainly instances where that happens. It's not a never situation, but it's few and far between that include that. Another thing is that often the purchase price is not included. And when I say purchase price, I mean like the true actual price that the grantor gave the grantee gave the grantor for that building. Most deeds will have some sort of sentence in it saying that this was an exchange for maybe $1 Here in Maryland, I see $5 a lot as the placeholder amount that's put into that deed. But that's obviously not what the person paid for the property. I was told a long time ago once by someone that the reason that part of the reason why deeds often don't include the actual purchase price is that it kind of like might negatively impact the taxes that are paid on that sale. I don't know if that's true or not, but just keep in mind that especially for modern deeds or mid-century kind of deeds, middle run kind of deeds, it often is not going to give you the accurate price. Older deeds usually have the accurate price. Really recent deeds usually have the price. When you're navigating these deeds, there's a really useful guide that the Maryland State Archive produced called Understanding Maryland Records. That's kind of like a glossary of legalese words that you're going to encounter in the deeds so that you can help, decipher what this thing is actually saying. Older deeds are going to be very heavily in that legalese. Newer deeds are kind of written in a more normal language. So sometimes, and even me, I'm reading a deed sometime and I get very confused on what they're trying to talk to me about. Another thing to keep in mind, especially for those researching in the greater Baltimore area, is the existence of ground rents or ground leases, they're also called. This is a condition where the building and the ground it sits on may be owned by different people. The person who owns the building is subject to an annual rent payment payable to the person who owns the ground, who owns that ground rent. This practice began in the colonial era as a means to keep home prices low. The house was cheap, but the land was expensive, so people could afford houses. It was an affordable housing measure. And in the years since, obviously, many homeowners have purchased their ground rent and now owned both. But there are still many properties in the city that have separate ownership for their ground and their homes. And again, even if they now currently own both, there is probably a significant period of that property's history where there are separate ownerships. So when you're doing deed research in Baltimore and you're getting into the weeds of all the different deeds, it can be kind of confusing because you're going to find deeds that are just the house and just the ground. So that's why being organized is really helpful so you can figure out, am I following the property, the building, or am I suddenly following the ground rent? Excellent. So the look and format of deeds have changed slightly over time, starting with, handwritten documents to, typed form, fill in the blank kind of documents like this one here on the screen to today's, modern computer made files. But for the most part, all deeds are going to contain the same key information in fairly the same order. So using, again, this example from Baltimore City on the screen, the first thing that you're going to see at the top of the page is that book and page number. It's literally stamped on to the top of it. The deed book and the page number. They are organized, and that is how they are recorded by your county clerk. While the indexes, the grantor and grantee indexes are organized by names. To actually go and pull that deed, you need to have those numbers to find it. Thank you. Next on your deed is going to be that grantor and grantee reference, right? Who is buying it, who is selling it, who is buying it. The grantor is the first part, and they're the ones selling it. The grantee is the second part. They're the ones buying it. Sometimes in this section, especially in older deeds, there might also be biographical information included. Here on this screen, you can see that this deed, the grantor was Sarah F. Wright. In a much earlier time period, it would be really kind of rare to just leave a woman's name single there. Like women didn't have legal autonomy for a long time. So in an older deed, it would be really likely to see this written as Sarah F. Wright, widow, or wife of, and then her husband's name, or single woman I've seen. But obviously we've kind of gotten rid of that in today and age, and it just simply says her name here. Another thing that is often included and the way that deeds are often, executed is that the owner has passed away. So the owner is not technically selling it. It's the trustee or the executor is doing that sale. So the grantor listing would say that it's, John Doe as trustee or executor of the property owner. You want to that obviously gives you an insight into the social history that was going on with that property and what was going on with the residents and what happened to them. But you also need to be mindful that that deed may be listed under that trustee's name in the inventory, but when you want to go and find the previous deed, you're not going to look under that trustee's name, right? Because they don't technically own it. You want to make sure you're looking over that deceased person's name because they're the grantor technically of that property. And I've seen lots of other little weird stuff that's included in those sections, especially if the property is a part of like a court case or is being sold because of some sort of judgment in a civil or a criminal matter. The next thing in your deed that is going to be really important is that lot description. So we already saw the simple legal description on our tax assessment document on SSTAT, but here on the deed is going to be a narrative description of the plot dimensions. So it will start with a starting point. It's usually a corner of an intersection of a street. In more rural settings, you often see starting points that are trees or certain natural elements in the environment, and then it'll give you the measurements of that dimension of your property. That is incredibly important. You want to start with your legal description of it as it is today. And again, as you go backwards and pull up every subsequent deed or previous deed, making sure that that property description is the same. And if it starts to change, is that because you've messed up and you looked at the wrong deed? Or is it that the property was subdivided or some other shenanigans happened and you need to figure out what that is? And then lastly, down at the bottom, highlighted in green, is a previous sale reference. It's not guaranteed to be included. I think that most deeds that I've seen here in Maryland do include it, but again, it's not a guarantee that you'll find it. And that is going to reference the most recent deed, the previous deed to the one that's being executed. It may also reference other legal documents that relate to this property. For example, a property that I was researching had a racial covenant, a racist document that said that certain people weren't allowed to own that. It wasn't part of the deed itself, but it referenced it in the deed saying, oh, well, you also have to follow this thing that was filed. So again, there might be other documents referenced in the deed. That is such a great thing when it happens because that cuts down on your time of needing to track down those documents. It gives you straight away what that previous sale is. And here you can see it tells us that Sarah F. Wright purchased the building in 1919, and it gives us the book and page number so we can go right ahead and find that document. All right, so how do we go ahead and find that document? First, in person, you can go to the county clerk's court, the county circuit courts to look at the books. They are usually the ones that hold those. The Maryland State Archives also has a collection of both hard copy and microfilm things. But the best and easiest way to do this is by checking mdlandrecs.net. Maryland has done a magical thing by requiring that all counties submit their copies of their deeds to the state, and it's accessible online through this system. Going to say that it's a magical website with tons of information, but it definitely takes a little getting used to and learning how to navigate it. It definitely took me a couple of times before I got the hang of how to not just use the system, but figuring out the organization of the documents and how to find the way that I'm going to find my deed or whatnot. It is a free program. You just have to create an account, but anyone can access it. It's super duper great. I'm just going to quickly go through, because again, it does kind of like take a minute to get through it. So once you sign in and you create your account, you're going to select the county that you want to search, where the red arrow is pointing. This screen for these examples, I'm using Garrett County to show us what's available. So all of the counties will look similar to this. On the left-hand side, you'll see the ways, the different ways that you can search and access the documents that are on this website. This column might be slightly different depending on your communities. Again, the larger areas, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, they often have additional ways, but for the most part, most counties are going to have this menu bar on the side here. The reason for the differences in this, even though it's all a central state document, is that originally these deeds were recorded and organized independently by each of the counties, right? So they had their own organization systems. Obviously, there was the main way with the book and page number and different rules made by the state that regulated how this process was going to go. But within their ability, each county kind of put their own little flair on it. So again, depending on which county you're searching in, what's available is going to vary slightly. So if you are going into this website and you know what your book and page number is, you went to SDAT and you got your book and page number, you can plop it right into that jump to new volume option right at the top. So you won't even have to like search for that document. You can plop it in right there. But if you don't have your book and page number, then you're going to use that individual search to look up that person's name, or if it's a corporation, you'll use that corporation search to find that person. It's important to keep in mind and pay attention to this date bracket that's included here. That's the purple arrow is pointing to. On this main page search by name, you're only going to be able to look up deeds that were recorded for Garrett County for 1982 through 2023. So in this window, you're only going to be able to access and search the names for those years. And again, that bracket of time is going to be slightly different for each county. So for here in Garrett County, if your deed was executed before 1982, what you're going to have to do is click on that active indices on the left-hand side. And then a new page will open and you'll see that drop-down menu of what are the other indexes that we can look at to find our deeds. And so here we see what's available in Garrett County. That first one on the list is that we can look up by the grantee name for deeds executed between 1872 and 1962, and so on and so forth. So, whatever you're trying to find, you click the appropriate index and then follow the instructions to search and navigate through those documents to find your deed. And that is an extraordinary crash course in how to access deeds. Again, I strongly recommend just playing around with that website for a little while and just trying to get the hang of it. I feel like I learn a new thing every time I use it. Maggie and I joke often about how I just figured this thing out in it and stuff like that. All right, so we're finished with deeds. We are going to move on to maps. When researching a property, maps help to further confirm when a property was built, dates of major improvements, and changes to street names and or numbering, house numbers. They may also be used to confirm changes in a ward or a district or other municipal identifiers like that. Plat maps and some atlases may also include property names, either for your property that you're looking for and the surrounding ones as well. And here on the screen, you can see how useful maps can be for, confirming the changes to your property over time. This picture was included in the Berlin House blog that we released, and it shows using Sanborn maps how we can follow the evolution of the structure, pinpoint when certain changes were made, and just follow it through time. So an incredibly helpful resource there. For the most part, the number and types of maps that are going to be available to you will very much depend on the property you're researching, so where it's located. Typically, more urban and developed areas will have more plot and block level maps, so more detailed maps like the one like Sanborn maps, and more rural and suburban areas are less likely to have those kinds of very zoomed in, close up kind of mapping available. Let's talk about atlases first. There's kind of two types of atlases, and you can see that two varieties here on the screen. Typically, these are produced by the municipalities themselves or on spec by kind of these big cartography companies that exist. There's usually two different types, as you can see here. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a page from a county atlas. And so this is District 1 from Frederick County. I forget the exact date of this map. It was 1800s. And so it is based on survey and shows the plotted roadways and markers for where different property owners are and different buildings are. But it is not accurate plot lines. It's not totally accurate outlines of the buildings. It's more of a reference point. The streets are definitely probably going to be more accurate, but you can't necessarily use this documentation as proof that the building is this shape or is located in this part of the lot versus a different part of the lot. On the right-hand side, you'll see an example of a block map, right? So this is an 1885 atlas of the city of Baltimore. It's a block level showing very pretty accurate dimensions of each of the buildings. This map is called a cadastral map or atlas. These are made by using accurate survey records and therefore can provide an accurate and legitimate information regarding legal land rights. So again, this one is based and drawn directly from those survey documents. So we can have that level of confidence and trust in that this is correctly and accurately just outlining the building and describing the building for us. This map is from G.W. Bromley & Co., which is one of the many national companies that made accurate survey maps like this. So while this one is for Baltimore, there is a Bromley Atlas for countless cities across the country. Hopkins is another company that made a lot of atlases. So you can go around the country and there are hundreds of Hopkins or Bromley atlases. Next are plat maps. So plat maps are those that show the exact boundaries of a property described in a deed. They are survey maps. You could also call them that. They're usually produced as part of a sale of a property or because of a planned development project or even to settle a land dispute. So again, they are measured drawings, surveyed drawings of your property, of your plat. Sometimes they are physically included in your deed, and that is like the luckiest day ever when they're just like in that deed book right there. But more often when you're reading through the deed, you'll see that it'll reference this is the property as drawn on plat number 55 in this book, and then you'll be able to go and find that book. On the right-hand side, you'll see a plat map for the Berlin House. We included this in our blog post. And you can see in this picture how there's like a really serious crease right down the middle. And so we were lucky, and this plat map was copied and included into the deed book. But when they made the microfilm of the deed book, they did not open the flap. So then we had to go track down the physical copy of this, and it was held by the state archive. So we were able to go and see it in person and take this photograph. For those that are looking to access these online, there is the magical website plats.net, where you can go in and pull copies, scanned copies of these, microfilm copies of these. It is important, you navigate it the same way that you do the MD land records. You select your county and then you go through and search for the plat that you're looking for. But it's really important to keep in mind that you can't search by address. You can't search by name. You need to have that plat number, that plat book, whatever that plat identifier is. That's how you're going to find it in here. Being very frank, I'm still learning how to use this one. I'm still exploring all the ways that you can utilize the search capabilities in here. So if somebody knows of secret ways to be able to look up that way, by all means, share it in the chat. But again, you need to make sure that you have that plat number when you get into this system. And then the last major type of map that you want to consult is the Sanborn fire insurance maps. So the Sanborns, which is what we basically call them, were created by the Sanborn Company and provide detailed maps of cities and towns intended to be used by insurance companies to assess their total liability. So again, these are being used by insurance companies. They are used by fire companies and police departments so that they have an accurate understanding of what materials a building is built of, what mechanicals are in a building so that they can protect their lives in responding to emergencies. So this is a very accurate, very detailed map. They are, the original copies, the hard copies, they are color coded as well. So they're color coded by the type of material the building is. And you can kind of see a hint of that color coding on this index page for Cambridge. But when you're accessing them online, they're usually photocopied or microfilmed, so they're not going to be in color, and they'll look something like what's on the right-hand side. While the company started in like the 1860s, here in Maryland, I think the earliest Sanborns that you can find for communities that have them is going to be around the 1880s. Again, because this is a company making it, this is not like a public service, this is part of this insurance company thing. They're only going to be making maps for communities that have a population over a certain number, that have a number of buildings over a certain level. It needed to be worthwhile for them to make that map. So again, not every community is going to have a Sanborn map, but many communities in Maryland do have them. As far as accessing Sanborn maps, many public libraries, college libraries have access to online versions of the Sanborn maps with your library card. And that's how we got the copy on the right-hand side. That's usually through a system called ProQuest. But the Library of Congress has a lot of copies of the full color versions of them. Again, not every the Library of Congress isn't going to have every single map for Maryland or Sanborn map that exists, but they have a lot of them there. And you can also go to your local public library, your historical society, history rooms, whatever that place is called in your local community. They may also have a hard copy of that so that you can see that color coding. Another nifty thing about Sanborn maps is that once they're made, they were just updated on top of it. So on the hard copy, you can often see where there's a piece of paper has been glued where that building was demolished, something happened to that building, or new buildings were added, and they've added that new updated information on top. So again, it's really fun to see them in person if you can do that. All right, that is a crash course of maps. Now we are going to jump into tax assessments. I see that people have already been putting some questions in the Q&A. Awesome, keep that up. All right, so these two resources are listed for, they are really important resources. They provide a really interesting bit of information that will be very difficult to find through other types of documents. But the thing about tax assessments and permits is that they are difficult to find. These are kind of the types of documents that were seen as disposable, I guess, or temporary for a lot of municipalities. You're constantly going to be updating your tax assessment records. And there is a benefit to keeping it for a certain period of time, but often older versions of these documents don't make it this far along. So again, it's definitely something worthwhile to go track down, but there really is no guarantee that you're going to be successful in finding these documentations. First, for tax assessments, they calculate the value of the property, which is then used to determine a property owner's tax liability. In showing the value of a property, historic tax assessments can help in identifying a construction date or when other major changes occurred by tracking that value over time. So if you have a tax assessment record that says that the house is valued at $400, and then the next year it's valued at $10,000, that's an incredible jump and not something that would be affected by a reassessment process, right? That had to have been because something was added to that building, a new, extra buildings were added, something was changed to make that difference happen. And when you pair that with other documentation, you can kind of figure out, you'll get to the bottom of what happened. And here on the screen, you'll see an assessment register for the Berlin house, again, included in our blog. Tax assessment records, like with the modern version that we saw in the beginning with SStat, they're going to be organized certain ways. Historically, they're usually organized by the name of the property owner. So that's why tax assessments is kind of that fourth thing that you want to look at, because first you need to make sure you know who all the property owners are for the lifetime of your building. So then you can then go and look up that property owner for the appropriate time period to see if they're in the assessment records. So for this time period, 1866, 1867, the owner of the Berlin house was Mary McDonald. And so we see the entries under her name of what she owns and the value given to them. And we see that in April, her house in Berlin, her frame house and lot in Berlin was assessed for $700, which is a good solid amount of money for that time period. Recent tax assessment records are going to be on that SStat website we looked at in the beginning. Historic records are going to be available. There's not online records. There might be some, stray records that have been scanned by different institutions available online that you might come across. But for the most part, the in-person searching is going to be through the county circuit court of your county or at the Maryland State Archives. So become friends with your librarians, become friends with your county clerk, so you can talk to them to figure out where these documents might be located. The one that you're seeing on the screen was in the collection of the Maryland State Archives, and we were able to put in a request to pull that from the the shelves so we could look at it in person. Shifting to permits, these are maintained at a city and town or county level. There is no coordination with the state in any way for building permits, and not in like the regulation of it. But obviously building permits and any associated blueprints that might have been filed would be incredibly helpful and interesting to look at for your property. Permitting requirements vary wildly from municipality to municipality and throughout history. So there again is no guarantee that your community even required permits to be accepted. And if they did, that they had kept those up until present day. If a municipality has retained those records, they may be stored on site with present day permit documentation. So you'll have to go to your building code or your building department, your planning department, whatever office handles that for your municipality. Or it might have been moved to an offsite archive facility. So again, talk to your municipality to see where those are, if those exist, and where they might be located. When you search through the Maryland State Archives database, they do have some building permit documents in their collection and some plans, but they're only from select counties for select time periods. So again, no guarantee that you'll be able to access those. All right, that is tax assessments and permits. Next, we are going to talk about census data. So census records are usually, you know, in normal conversations or whatever, are mainly associated with genealogical research, but people live and work in buildings. So by looking people up in the census, you can get another way to figure out, you know, who is using these buildings and how are these buildings being used. Also, the census is going to give you a peek into the people who are not the named man, for the most part, as the owner on the deed. It's going to give you all the people that are living in that house with him, you know, looking at back in time. So again, incredible information speaking to the social history of your building. Since 1790, the federal census has been taken every 10 years and includes all of these biographical information about our community's residents. Because of the 72-year restriction on access to the census, the most recent year available is only 1950. Which is fine. Keep in mind, again, that entries are not necessarily going to be in address order. And from my experience, I think for a lot of communities, you really don't see a reference to a street or a house number until we get into the 1900s, until we get into the turn of the last century, 19-teens, 1920s. Censuses before that are not going to usually reference streets. In bigger cities, that might happen earlier. But for most communities in Maryland having so many rural and suburban areas, street names might not be included. When researching census records online, you know, all the different ancestry.coms and other websites, you really just need to know your person's name and some key biographical information about them so that you can put them into the search bar and then see all the results and you know, review those. But when you're searching census documents in person, you need to know the ward number or the enumeration district. And you can see here on this census from 1900, right here in the corner, it shows us this page is reflecting the enumeration district number 24. What does that mean? I don't know. Every community is going to be different, right? Sometimes it correlates to the actual election districts, and sometimes they're completely different drawn up. Well, what you would need to do is go to the first page, the very first page of this census, and there'll be a map saying what all the enumeration districts are. When you search these in person at either the state archive or local libraries, college libraries, historical societies, they often pull out that map and keep it as a separate document. So it makes it even easier to figure that out. But when you're flipping through hard copies or microfilm, you need to know which district it's in and then go to that district and look for the name that you're looking for. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing census is that often it's been my experience that if there are boarders or renters in that home, they might not necessarily be listed with the owner occupant that is also residing in that property. Recently, I was researching a building in Baltimore City, And I found the property owner, it was a brownstone in Bolton Hill. And so the property owner lived on the first floor, and then all the upper floors were rented out. And I found him and his family in one section. And then because I knew some of the names of the renters from looking at newspaper mentions, I found all of the renters of that house on a completely different page. So again, you might need to, look for, come back and forth between the census. Once you find new names and discover new people, you might need to come back and find them, because they're not necessarily going to be nice, clean. Every single body who lives in this house is right here all together. Excellent. And then here is just for reference, what one of those online searching page looks for. Like I said, if you want to go in person to look at census, it's the Maryland State Archives, the Maryland Center for History and Culture. Lots of public and college libraries have hard copies, historical societies. But for online searching, it's pretty much Ancestry.com, Heritage Quest. There's FamilySearch.org. They're all owned by Ancestry. And for the most part, for Ancestry and Heritage Quest, many of our public libraries provide access to these websites with your library card. So as long as you have a library card, you'll be able to access those either on your home Wi-Fi or on the Wi-Fi in the library. FamilySearch.org is also owned by Ancestry, but it's a completely different website, and you can create an account for free and be able to access them through there as well. All right. That is census data. And lastly, we have reached newspapers, publications, and images. All of the kind of ephemera stuff that helps to fill in a lot of the data that is missing from the other documents that we just looked at. And the other reason why I save this stuff to the end is because to fully and successfully search these resources, you really need to have the whole gambit of the possible search terms that you need. So knowing who all the owners are, having an idea of who all the different people that were living in those buildings, and being able to have that big, huge list of all the possible things that you could search, so that you can just sit there and plug those in and see what comes up. When searching through these things, through these different websites for, newspapers and other publications of the time period, you really need to keep in mind that, style guides and other resources that now standardize how we describe things. Newspapers are pretty consistent. This organization is going to be called this name in no matter where it's printed, or this event is going to be referred to this way no matter which newspaper it's talked about in. That's a new thing that didn't exist for the vast majority of the history of printing. There is very little standardization going on. So you need to make sure that you're, having some variety to the way that you're searching, because it's not going to be a clean way that things are described. Also keep in mind that there's a lot of unspoken rules of decorum and things like that. So there's a lot of euphemisms used in newspapers back in the day, a lot of skirting around certain topics. So again, if you're searching, a really simple kind of silly example of that, you're trying to find a marriage announcement, a wedding announcement for something like, here in, now present day newspapers, there's kind of a standardization to how that column looks in the newspaper, but it's not standardized back in certain time periods. So they might use the word wedding, they might use the word marriage, they might use a different word that I can't even think of right now. So again, like the variety of those search terms, that you're making sure to fix that. If you're researching your house and you have discovered some sort of nefarious thing that your house has been involved in, or that the people who lived in your house have been involved in, or some unfortunate event happened in your house or associated with your house. Again, while modern newspapers might point blank explain what that horrible thing was, the olden those newspapers might not be as forthcoming with that description. Another thing, as part of that is to keep in mind that people are not just our events and situations described, and organization names are described in a certain way, but people are described differently back in time versus today. A significant period of time, women are rarely mentioned by name in publications, but rather by their husband's name or their father's name. For example, you're trying to find someone whose name is Jane Doe, and she's married to John Doe. She's not going to be listed. I very doubt that she would be listed as Mrs. John Doe. she's going to be listed as Mrs. Jane Doe. She's going to be listed as Mrs. her husband. So again, having that full understanding of who your property owners are, getting that census data so you can figure out what is the right way to search for that person so I successfully find them. In that same vein, in that same thread, there's a lot of erasure of people and communities from various publications because they were not the white elite males that owned the businesses and owned those properties. Most of mainstream newspapers for much of Maryland's history will not include social commentary and stories that mention Black and brown people. That's something we just have to understand the unfortunate of it. Depending on the time period, narratives about ethnic Europeans are not going to be included, or if they are included, they're going to be written in very racist ways and bigoted ways. So that's going to include, Irish people, Polish people, Italian, Jewish people. They're not going to be included, for certain periods of time. They're going to be spoken and described and referenced to in different ways. That being said, African-American communities and other types of ethnic groups often have, because of that, created their own publications and their own newspapers so that their stories could be told. So again, depending on what the story is with your building and who you're looking up, you'll want to make sure that you're not just looking at the Baltimore Sun or the other conventional mainstream newspapers, that you're going and looking, are there African-American newspapers that I could be looking up? Is there a Jewish newspaper? Is there a German newspaper? Making sure that you're expanding your search to catch all the different publications that might exist. Again, check out the property research guide that we produce. There's a lot more information about the different sites that you can access that are free and paid. On the screen are just the kind of the logos of my favorite ones that I look at the most. Newspapers.com. Unfortunately, this site does require a subscription. There are a few libraries that give you access free with your library card. But for the most part, you're probably going to have to pay for this one. It is great. It has so many newspapers from across the country. It is really a great website. The Library of Congress, I think we think of it as having just the most important things for our national story, but they have tons of stuff that relate to very local things. And especially something else that they have in their collection is all the HABS documentation. And of course, now that I'm going to say HABS, I'm not going to remember what HABS stands for. Maybe Maggie can put it in the chat if she does it. But those are going to give you incredibly detailed photographs or architectural drawings of different buildings. So in the 1930s and up and through today, there are people that go around and take formal documentation of historic resources. And there are lots of Maryland sites that have been documented, and those documents are all on Library of Congress. The Internet Archive is this crazy weird place that just has tons of stuff that's found on the internet. You can keyword search. It's a great, easy to navigate. Google Books has tons of stuff on it. There's a lot of overlap between those as well. And then Happy Trust is one that I absolutely love. It's very similar to the Internet Archive and overlaps with that and Google Books, but Happy Trust focuses on providing free access to digitized materials from research libraries. So these things that you find on Happy Trust, for the most part, are not going to be, documents or materials that some like rando on the internet made. It's going to be stuff that's in a collection from, the University of Maryland, the University of Michigan, wherever. So you know that it's been scanned properly, correctly, that the documentation is correct. It's all those types of things. So I found a lot of great things on Happy Trust over the years. That is the last document that we're going to talk about. That was a lot of things, and I'm very proud of myself that we just got through that in an hour. Congratulations to everybody. Again, the whole point of this research tonight and what started off putting this program on was preparing this blog post about the Berlin House, a project that we're working on in partnership with the city to rehabilitate this property in Brunswick, and then make sure to access our property research guide that gives you way more details than what we just covered tonight, even though we covered a lot of things tonight. So with that, let's look at some of these questions. Thank you for the applause. All right, so our first question here is, oh, did my screen just go away? I am going to stop sharing just for this moment. Are all deeds and other land records kept by the state of Maryland, or are some maintained by the county? Yes, I mean, through that MD Land Records website, there is, I don't know the exact terms of the legislation or the policies that were passed, but all of the counties are supposed to submit that copies of those records so that they can be included in that website. But the hard copies of those are still going to be maintained by those counties. So again, you can research from the comfort of your own home on MD Land Records, or you can go into that circuit court office or whatever building they've moved those records to and physically look through all of those deed books. Next question, any thoughts on figuring out deeds when they are buildings donated to churches for a period of time? I'm not sure I understand this question. I don't think I've seen a deed that was for a period of time, that was a termed thing. So Judith, who asked that question, if you wanted to submit some more information either in the chat to explain that, but I'm not quite sure how to give you the answer for that one. Again, anyone else who has questions, please, by all means, submit that in the Q&A. I've had an amazing time doing this presentation tonight and working with Maggie to create this research guide. It started because we both were working on separate things and just casually mentioned to each other that we were both doing it, and realized that each of us had new particular details about things that the other didn't. So then we collaborated, worked on the blog post, worked on creating that property guide, and now tonight with our program. Well, if there are no other questions for tonight, thank you very much. Then I will release you so you enjoy the rest of your evening. Again, thank you so very much for joining us. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the different links and copies of the recording. And certainly you have our contact information. Please reach out if you have more detailed questions, more complex questions. Preservation Maryland, we are your statewide preservation organization. Please make sure to follow us on Facebook. You can head over and all social media. You can head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter. If you registered for tonight's program, you're already signed up for our newsletter, and get info about all the different things that we're working on and future programming made available. So with that, thank you guys. Have a great rest of your night.